Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, May the 18th. Andy Burnham said over the weekend that he wants a circuit breaker from politics in this country, and he began his campaign to return to Westminster and onto Downing Street, telling the Mirror, "We've got to show the public we're prepared to take a very different approach." But if a different approach means harmony, well, he quickly discovered that that is a harder thing to secure. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. At the end of last week, it felt like the stars were aligning such that Andy Burnham could have the best possible shot at returning to Westminster and succeeding Keir Starmer. He was given the opportunity to fight the seat of Makerfield in Greater Manchester, just next to Wigan. Rivals stumbled and agreed a longer timetable for the leadership contest, which would have allowed him to take part if he won.
Friends of Keir Starmer are even starting to engage with the question of whether there could be a timetable under which the Prime Minister would agree to move along from Downing Street. According to Tom Baldwin in The Observer, the Burnham camp envisages an implicit timetable in which Starmer leaves Downing Street after a valedictory party conference in September, although he added that some on Starmer's team in Downing Street now also talk softly about how they would like him to leave with some dignity, which might imply going a bit earlier.
Yeah, no, Tom's an important voice to listen to. He was seen with some of Starmer's team last week. All of this depends on Andy Burnham returning to Westminster when the by-election in Makerfield is held. Now, that seems to be likely to be on June the 18th. Now, people who know the seat have been telling me, and I can see they've been telling other people as well, that they think that Andy Burnham has a 45% chance of him doing just that, 45% chance of winning this by-election. There's no doubt Andy Burnham's personal brand means he's probably got the highest chance of pretty much anybody in terms of winning that seat that was vacated by Josh Simons. But that means it's still far from a given. And it strikes me, Anne, that a lot of this will come down in Makerfield to the question of what the voters there kind of think that they're the sort of question that they think they're answering. So this could turn into a sort of contest in Makerfield, which is all about vote Labour to keep reform out, locally, nationally, right? That might be the essay question, and we'll see whether people dislike Nigel Farage more than they dislike Labour, and it'll be that. But conversely, a vote for Labour might be seen as a vote to get rid of Keir Starmer, so sort of almost an act against Labour. So, that could end up being one of the ways it shakes down. Or it could be perceived, and I think there is an underpriced chance of this. If you vote reform and reform wins, you throw Labour into absolute abject chaos. And because I do think that if Andy Burnham does not win this by-election, I can't begin to envisage the kind of nightmare that Labour faces post June the 18th. The whole Labour movement has broken the current Prime Minister, kind of elected by a landslide. And at that point, they'll have no semblance of what to do. So, I mean, that is the ultimate kind of chaos outcome. And the British public are quite good at chaos outcomes, it seems, as are our politicians. And by the way, it's in that scenario that I do wonder whether or not George Osborne's dream of having Yvette Cooper as Prime Minister starts to hover into view as a safe pair of hands in the chaos.
I think there's no doubt that this Makerfield selectorate is going to be one of the most significant in British political history, Sam, in terms of its knock-on effects, as you point out. One more question that's emerged over the last day and a half or so is the idea of having Labour move to rejoin the EU and to reshape itself as a party that is bent on that in the long term. So at a fringe meeting in Liverpool last September, Andy Burnham, no less, said, "I want to rejoin the EU and I hope it happens in my lifetime." And then he went on to talk about unions of all sorts, but he definitely included the European Union explicitly in that list. He said, "That's part of unions. That's my belief, and I say it clearly."
So by Saturday morning, journalists, campaigners had dug up those quotes. So in an interview on Saturday afternoon, Andy Burnham looked to me like he was trying to put that on the back burner. He told ITV's Dan Hewitt that he thought that there was a, quote, long-term case for rejoining the EU, but added, I'm not advocating that in this by-election. He sort of wants to focus on stuff domestically. Britain's got to focus very much on the here and now and the issues that are affecting people. This is domestic priorities, and then goes on and reiterates, these are the things we need to focus on rather than getting trapped in a debate about the EU. Now, I suppose one of the questions is whether or not just saying we're not going to talk about it is sufficient to ensure that voters don't and opponents don't. Reform UK are quite clearly going to put this pro-EU comment on pretty much every leaflet in this heavily Brexit area. But I suppose all of that was before they gamed Wes Streeting coming out and arguably making Andy Burnham's life a lot more difficult.
Oh, definitely. I think that's the intention. Former Health Secretary blasting away at the codes of Labour speak on relations with Europe and rejoin, saying the biggest economic opportunity we have is on our doorstep. We need a new special relationship with the EU. Our future lies with Europe. And one day, back in the EU. Now, Lisa Nandy, who was campaigning in her next door seat for Andy Burnham at the weekend, one of his strongest backers, was first out of the traps on Sky News, calling Streeting's words odd and signalling very strongly that she thought it was a mistake to go back to the Brexit wars.
That's right. I mean, Lisa Nandy is probably one of the least Euro enthusiast members of the cabinet. She was sort of pouring a bit of cold water on Keir Starmer's EU sort of reset just a few days ago. So I doubt she's even that comfortable with Andy Burnham's starting point, but she wouldn't be saying that because she's one of his biggest backers. But the difficulty, Anne, and now I have a confession, I've kind of stepped away over the weekend a tiny bit back from politics for a couple of days, if you can believe it. And I sort of picked it all up last night. And if you're not paying attention, I have to say, it sounded to me like Wes Streeting and Andy Burnham were basically saying the same thing. And so I was sort of slightly taken aback by the fact that Andy Burnham's team were attempting aggressive differentiation this morning when I woke up. I do get that the emphasis on Europe is probably the last thing Labour needs to win this by-election. But given that Reform were always going to front row Andy Burnham's comments on this, and Reform were always going to pick this up. They needed a plan, the Burnham team, to deal with the European Union question. So I wonder whether or not just blaming Wes Streeting is quite enough. Maybe Andy Burnham will come out at the Great North Investment Summit in Leeds, if he does turn up, it's a little bit TBC, and clarify, for instance, if he'd put EU rejoining in the Labour manifesto. Is that far enough in the future, or is that too soon? What do you make of where we've suddenly ended up in the EU debate 10 years after the Brexit referendum?
I think your last point there about is it now, is it soon, is it in the future timeline is really the differentiating point. This has all been scrabbled together, right? This hasn't come out of some big thumb-sucking reconsideration of where we are in Labour with our EU policy, as you can imagine, Sam. I think it has just been sort of typed out in a lot of cases on a sort of tablet and kind of read out in Andy Burnham's case to get rid of the contradiction or try to address that contradiction about what his views were at conference last year. And I suppose all he's really saying, just to sort of defend the Burnham proposition, this is not what we're talking about at this by-election. He's sort of saying, well, yeah, these are my views, but that is not really what I'm being asked about now. I'm asked about the challenge of reform and ultimately whether I want to replace Keir Starmer and the Europe stuff we can do later. Whereas where Streeting is putting it the other way around and saying, I stand for this reconnection. I stand for getting rid of some of the ambivalence around the Keir Starmer position. And I'm prepared to lean into it. And frankly, I would go as fast as possible with some form of deeper reconnection. I had a quick look at these positions, Sam, for our German sister paper, Die Welt, at the weekend, who got very interested in the minutiae of Labour positions with the verb at the end. And one of the that was, very interesting, I think, to them is like, what does it mean in practice? Is it the same or different to what Starmer is doing now. So this seems to be like three very quick points on what might be going on here under the surface. If you're Wes Streeting, you are at least opening yourself to going much further than the kind of deals that Keir Starmer has been trying to get over the line, youth mobility, sectoral deals and the like. You're probably having to consider opening to some sort of pay-to-play access to get Britain those economic benefits that he thinks will accrue from getting closer or back closer with the EU. And in fairness to the Streeting position, Sam, I mean, he would say if you scratch the surface of a reconnector in cabinet, people like Nick Thomas Simmons or Peter Carl, that probably they do hanker to rejoin. So you might as well just say so. And then he's trying to link it to a kind of values argument. And this is something I think if you look at the newly rebranded Labour Together, now Think Labour, there's quite a lot of people around there who have this view that you create a sort of thread between economic opportunity for the UK by getting rid of trade frictions over time with the EU, also standing up more to America first. And I thought that was an under-analysed bit of Streeting's call, was that it was for more distance from the US, and that you then linked all of that to, our values are much closer to Europe and we all oppose Russia together. Bit of a wrinkle on that one. Defence and security cooperation is pretty good with Europe at the moment, especially with Germany, but not only. But it's not buying us any trade favours because, as one of the Brussels officials I spoke to for this piece said, well, they just don't look at things in the same way Streeting does. They don't see defence and good values vis-a-vis Russia and having more distance from Donald Trump as meaning you get a better trade deal. In the end, isn't it just more of a snooker move, from Streeting in the short term, because it makes life much more difficult for Andy Burnham, whereas the worst thing that happened to Streeting is people like me pick apart his views, but that's not relevant, in terms of his leadership hopes. But it does make life a bit more difficult for Andy.
That's right. I mean, as ever, we're having a conversation about our relationship with the EU just in pure domestic terms, and any debate about rejoin the EU has to confront the really difficult conundrum. Would the EU require us to take the euro, rejoin free movement area, enter Schengen, and how much would you have to pay in order to get access to services, all of which Britain left the EU with a pretty good deal by common consensus on. Would that deal be open? Many people think not, but not impossible. I'm sure there'll be sounds coming out of Europe over the coming days. I agree, and I agree with you. Look, I mean, I think it's fair enough on one level, the point by Team Streeting, you can't win an argument that you don't make. And now he's a backbencher, not without ambition himself. Why shouldn't he? But it feels like Andy Burnham is a bit more of the man of the moment, because we didn't think Wes Streeting got the numbers last week, and therefore, Andy Burnham looks a little bit more like he's in pole position for the leadership if he wins this by-election. And we heard a lot from him we saw him not only jogging around a rather busy A road in Manchester, but also he gave a number of quite chunky interviews. And he did laid out a whole load of specifics. So he said he was committed to the current fiscal rules. He made a big play of the need for more council and social housing. He also put front and centre the need for more public control, using his B bus network in Manchester as the sort of example. Now, really, really important, it's public control, not nationalisation in the form that some of the Labour left sort of slightly confuse it with. That what's going on in Manchester is very much more similar to the operating model of TfL in London, Transport for Greater Manchester. It oversees a unified brand, it manages the ticketing, owns some of the infrastructure, but the day-to-day driving and vehicle maintenance are handled by private companies. So it's a little bit more nuanced and more interesting than that I think people just quite assume, that, particularly down in Westminster, where they're famously myopic. And actually, that programme, as described there, isn't a million miles away from the existing Labour manifesto, I thought.
Oh, interesting. What I took from that was there's just that bit of a glint still. I don't think you'd like it to be said like this, but I'll do it anyway, of a kind of Blairite awareness there in the way that that is framed not as nationalisation, but as public accountability, that you have a kind of public-private mix in there. And that is really the cradle from which Andy Burnham comes in his thinking about public services when he was working alongside the Blair project, which doesn't seem to feature very highly on anybody's bumper stickers if they're running for leader these days. But it's still in the DNA, I would suggest. One thing I think we can expect is maximum Manchesterism from Burnham, taking credit for the kind of big projects, public, private, also in the way that they were constructed. And he inherited those from an extraordinarily effective figure, the late Howard Bernstein, in transforming the city from the post-industrial doldrums from the 1980s to a really vibrant commercial and business centre we know today, and crucially, one that can attract billions of pounds in investment. If you remember when I was interviewing the new German ambassador to London, Susanna Baumann, she told me she'd made a beeline for Manchester. She was genuinely enthused. She'd gone to meet Andy Burnham, but really she'd gone to see this Manchester she said she'd seen as a young diplomat in Britain, and she couldn't believe how it had changed. She sort of saw it as something of a model for German cities in former industrial belts that are struggling at the moment. So I think we'll hear a lot about that. And Andy Burnham didn't exactly drive that. He came to it late, but he didn't mess it up either, as it's fair to say. Playbook noting today that life goes on sort of as usual with the business community still being quartered at Westminster, and the Prime Minister is hosting a reception with that crowd at number 10, and he's going to tell apprentices and business owners that they should work more together for long-term economic growth. No laughing at the back, says my colleague Andrew MacDonald, writing the playbook, and that's his line, not mine, if you want to blame anyone.
We ought to spend just a moment looking at the sort of rubble that's been left behind by the rebellion juggernaut. A somewhat broken Keir Starmer spent the weekend at Chequers and appears to be preparing a policy blitz in the coming days and weeks. There are reports he's trying to finalise spending on defence, although it doesn't feel like that's going to come out this side of recess. What might come out this side of recess was a reversing of the 5p fuel duty rise announced in the budget last year and due to come in from September. I mean, that is mega expensive, and they'll be doing it outside of a budget, so that's quite a big move to do. That was first revealed by The Sun on Sunday. But I think there's a bigger point, Anne. I don't think people should underestimate how basically broken it is in number 10. I'm picking up tears, kind of frustrated aggression between people, and just a complete lack of bandwidth to deal with day-to-day stuff because it's such an existential crisis in number 10. The atmosphere was described as, quote, horrendous. And one of the reasons that'll be the case, we touched on this last week, but when a government all but collapses, and I use that advisedly, but this government is really struggling to function on a day-to-day basis. Other bits of Whitehall all but go on strike. I talked last week about the sort of unofficial purdy you get when you're transitioning between prime ministers. And of course, we're not even at that point yet. But I think what everybody can see from space is that the man at the top of the political system just does not have the authority and the writ to really push anything tricky through at the moment. And, if that's the case, why would Whitehall departments do loads of work and take risks for a man who's not going to be able to deliver a policy because he's not strong enough? So, whether it's the Home Office or elsewhere, I think there is a frustration right at the centre that they don't feel that the levers of government sort of are working pretty much at all.
And it's very personal, isn't it? However critical one may be of Keir Starmer and how he managed to get into this position as Prime Minister less than 2 years into his tenure. Yeah, as you point out, you've got people who work closely with him, some of whom are thinking, well, it's probably time you moved along. Others are going to fight tooth and nail to the last minute. You've got relations in cabinet where some of the people that he raised up, I think this is something that is coming out, is that he's very angry, even with a lot of people who are not out there saying in public he should go, but the kind of likes of the Shabana Mahmood or Ed Miliband, he presumably thinking, well, I raised you into the positions you are in under my leadership, and unless he's getting 100%, we really think you should stay here from them, then he's probably feeling very bruised and quite annoyed or worse with them. And that transacts very quickly, doesn't it, into the teams, into the advisors, and into the mood. The other question is, we touched on here what happens at the Defence Investment Plan, which as we've been announcing and highlighted before Christmas in a story that both of our sides worked on, about the fact that it was delayed and wasn't happening. And now we're still talking about this 18 billion more for defence over about 4 years. Taking such a long time to come through. And playbook hearing, it's not likely to drop this week. I agree, it's more likely to be after recess. But the point is, in the end, is it really as big a deal if you're going to talk about defence and security as the backbone of your premiership? And I just wonder whether we're going to look back on this period and think what came out of it was really small potatoes, even on the things that the Prime Minister does say he cares about.
In the end, everyone's just going to turn to, for instance, Andy Burnham in the first instance to see what he thinks as well, before you pay any particular heed to a plan suddenly announced by Keir Starmer. You remember the sort of final policy blitz by people like Theresa May and other prime ministers that try in the last few minutes of their premiership to enact a legacy, and I think some of Theresa May's net zero stuff was in that category. So I think all of that is quite tricky. Right, we are pretty much at the end. I am still in recovery mode, and I have to confess, after a very, very painful half marathon. I do want to say thank you to everybody who sponsored, if not me, then the Literacy Pirates charity for the Hackney Half Marathon I did yesterday. There are lots of broken people in Westminster. I can contribute to that today. So thank you very much indeed, and on we go.
I knew you'd be sitting down this morning to record the podcast. Do your legs work at all at the moment?
Barely.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'll see you tomorrow.